Everyone laughed when a woman inherited an abandoned house, but what she found inside shocked everyone and made her call the police immediately. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments where you're watching this video from. Leah had grown used to living alone, far from the echoes of her childhood home and the tangled web of family expectations that had once tried to hold her in place. The city had become her refuge, a place where anonymity wrapped around her like a shield, where the noise of the streets and the rhythm of daily routines drowned out the memories she had spent years trying to forget. At 35, she had carved out a quiet life as a university librarian, surrounded by books and silence, where nobody asked too many questions about her past. She was the kind of woman who blended into the background, not because she lacked presence, but because she had learned that invisibility was often safer than being noticed. Her family had never understood her. In their eyes, she was the one who had turned her back on tradition, on the small southern community where everyone's life seemed intertwined with gossip and obligations. For them, her departure was not just a physical act of leaving at 18. It was betrayal. Years had passed since she last spoke more than a few strained words to her relatives, and in that silence she had convinced herself that she didn't miss them. If they had noticed her absence, they had never reached out. The severed bond was mutual, and she had grown to accept it. That was why the phone call startled her so deeply. It came on a gray Tuesday afternoon, the kind of day where the city streets blurred under drizzle and the library seemed even quieter than usual. She had just finished shelving a stack of returned books when her cell phone buzzed. The number was unfamiliar, and for a fleeting moment she considered ignoring it. But curiosity, always a persistent whisper in the back of her mind, made her answer. "Miss Parker?" the voice asked. It was smooth, professional, belonging to a man who introduced himself as Mr. Halpern, a notary handling the estate of her late grandmother. For a moment, Leah thought she had misheard. Grandmother. The word barely stirred a memory, as if it belonged to a story someone else had lived. "Yes," Leah replied cautiously. "I'm calling to inform you that your grandmother recently passed away. I'm sure this must be difficult news to receive." Difficult? Leah felt almost nothing. The image of her grandmother was blurred and incomplete. A stern figure in faded dresses who never smiled much, who seemed to disapprove of everything Leah ever did. She hadn't spoken to her in nearly 2 decades. The grief she expected to feel never arrived. Instead, there was only a hollow echo where sorrow should have been. "I see," she said flatly. "There is more," the notary continued, his tone carrying a faint weight, as though he anticipated her disbelief. "Your grandmother left behind a will, drafted only weeks before her passing. You, Miss Parker, are named in it." Leah froze. For years, she had been convinced that her family wanted nothing to do with her. Why would her grandmother, of all people, choose to leave her anything? The idea made little sense. "Named in the will?" she repeated, almost laughing. "That is correct. You are expected at the reading of the will in 2 days at my office. The other beneficiaries will be present. I must insist you attend, as there are legal matters that cannot proceed without you." After ending the call, Leah sat at her desk for a long time, the words echoing in her mind. Her grandmother, the woman who had barely spoken to her, had left her something. The absurdity gnawed at her. Perhaps it was nothing, perhaps some trivial keepsake chosen out of spite. But the timing was strange. Drafted only weeks before her death, the notary had said. It sounded intentional, purposeful, as if her grandmother had wanted Leah's name on that paper for a reason. That night, Leah could not sleep. The thought of seeing her family again filled her with unease. She pictured their faces, her aunts with their sharp tongues, her uncles with their judgmental frowns, her cousins who once mocked her for being different. She imagined their eyes when they saw her walk into the notary's office, and her stomach twisted. Part of her wanted to stay away, to let the mystery remain unsolved. She had built her life without them. Why invite old wounds to reopen? But curiosity, that old relentless companion, whispered louder. If she ignored this, it would haunt her. What had her grandmother meant by including her? What message, if any, lingered in the ink of that will? The questions gnawed until she finally booked a ticket back to the town she had sworn never to see again. 2 days later, Leah stood outside the notary's office, her pulse quickening as she recognized the row of cars already parked outside. The building was small, brick-faced, and unremarkable, but for her it felt like a threshold into a past she thought she had abandoned. She hesitated before pushing open the door. Inside, her entire family was already gathered, seated around a long wooden table. The air was heavy with silence, the kind that burned more than any spoken insult. Every pair of eyes turned toward her, cold and sharp, stripping her bare with their disapproval. No one smiled. No one greeted her. She felt like an intruder at her own bloodline's gathering. Mr. Halpern, the notary, wasted no time. He cleared his throat and began reading aloud the details of the will. Leah sat stiffly in her chair, half listening, her mind distracted by the heat of resentment radiating from her relatives. The inheritance was divided into predictable pieces: money, cars, heirlooms, antiques. One cousin received her grandmother's jewelry, another the family home in town. As each name was called, the recipients nodded with smug satisfaction, their eyes flickering toward Leah with unspoken glee, as if reminding her she didn't belong. Minutes passed. Leah wondered if her name had been mentioned by mistake, if she had traveled all this way for nothing. She was ready to leave when Mr. Halpern paused, his eyes scanning the paper. He raised an eyebrow, almost as if he were surprised himself, before speaking again. "And to my granddaughter, Leah Parker, I leave my property located outside of town, a parcel of land containing a farmhouse and surrounding acreage." The room fell silent. For the first time since she had entered, all eyes were truly on her. Murmurs rippled through the air. A farmhouse? No one seemed to know what property this was. Her cousins exchanged puzzled glances. One of her aunts muttered that she had never heard of such a place. The notary continued providing the exact location, but his voice blurred in Leah's ears. A farmhouse in the woods. It sounded worthless, and perhaps it was, yet the surprise on her family's faces stirred something in her chest. If none of them knew about this place, then why had her grandmother left it to her alone? When the reading concluded, her relatives signed the papers for their inheritances. They avoided her gaze, but the tension was palpable. Some whispered under their breath, others smirked. The message was clear. While they had received wealth and comfort, Leah had been given a burden. She signed her papers last, her hand trembling slightly as she accepted the deed. The ink on the page felt heavier than she expected, as if she were binding herself to something unknown. The moment she stepped outside, she caught the sharp laughter of her cousins behind her, mocking her misfortune. But Leah walked away without reacting. There was a new weight pressing against her mind, a strange blend of dread and curiosity. That night, as she sat alone in a rented motel room, Leah unfolded the map the notary had provided. The farmhouse lay tucked in a dense stretch of forest about 30 minutes from town. Remote, forgotten, hidden. She stared at the location for a long time, her pulse unsteady. It could be nothing, a collapsing ruin waiting to swallow her in dust and regret. Or it could be something else, something her grandmother had kept secret for reasons unknown. Leah did not yet know why she felt compelled to see it for herself, but deep down she sensed that turning away now would leave a shadow across her life forever. The motel room where Leah had spent the night after the will reading was quiet except for the hum of an air conditioner struggling against the humid southern heat. She had barely slept, tossing and turning as her mind replayed the events of the day. Her relatives' stares had followed her even into dreams, their smirks and whispers clawing at her peace of mind. Yet, beneath the unease there was a restless pull, a gnawing compulsion that refused to release her. The farmhouse in the woods. The deed, folded neatly in her bag, felt heavier than it should have. It had weight beyond its paper, a kind of silent pressure. Each time she closed her eyes, she saw her grandmother's stern face, eyes narrowed as though measuring her from some distant place. "What did you leave me?" she thought in the dark. "What did you want me to find?" By morning, the decision was made. She would go see the place, no matter what waited for her there. It was not practicality that drove her. There was little chance the farmhouse was worth any money, and even less chance she could manage it from the city. It was curiosity, sharpened by the peculiar silence of the rest of her family. None of them had known the house existed. None of them had claimed any knowledge of land hidden away in the forest. For a family that thrived on gossip, secrets, and pride, such ignorance was almost unthinkable. That fact alone made Leah's chest tighten with the need to see it with her own eyes. She rented a car that afternoon, the cheapest model available, its upholstery smelling faintly of cigarettes. As she pulled out of the motel lot and turned onto the main road, she felt the first shiver of nerves. The highway stretched out under a broad blue sky, heat shimmering above the asphalt, and as she left the town behind, memories began to surface unbidden. Every mile carried her deeper into the landscape of her childhood, and with it came the ghosts of things she had long tried to forget. The fields lined with rusting tractors, the crooked fences leaning under the weight of kudzu, the distant barns with the roofs sagging into themselves. All of it whispered of the world she had once fled. The air was thicker here, heavy with the scent of pine and earth. Cicadas sang in relentless waves, their voices merging into a drone that wrapped around her car and sank into her bones. She passed the gas station where her uncles used to drink black coffee before heading to the lumber yard. The small white church where her cousins had been married stood at the corner of a road that now seemed too narrow for the weight of her memories. Faces from the past appeared in her mind. The girls at school who laughed at her accent when she came back from the city one summer. The neighbors who whispered about her mother when bills went unpaid. Leah gripped the steering wheel harder. This was why she had left and never looked back. The town never forgave or forgot, and for someone like her, different even among her own, belonging had always been out of reach. As the road narrowed, the GPS guided her off the highway and onto a cracked two-lane road that seemed to lead nowhere. Trees arched over the pavement, their branches forming a tunnel that blocked out the sun. Shadows swallowed the car, and Leah rolled down her window to let in air that smelled damp and green, like moss after rain. The sound of cicadas gave way to birdsong and the distant rustle of unseen creatures. Finally, the road ended at a narrow dirt path barely wide enough for her car. She hesitated, staring at the rutted track vanishing into the forest. According to the map, this was the only way in. Her pulse quickened as she shifted the car into gear and pressed forward. Branches scraped against the sides, leaves brushed across the windshield, and for a few tense moments she felt as though the forest itself resisted her intrusion. Then, suddenly, the trees parted and the farmhouse appeared. It was worse than she expected. The roof sagged, shingles missing like teeth from a decayed smile. Windows were boarded over, their wood splintered and gray. Vines crawled up the walls, weaving themselves into cracks and pulling the structure tighter into the earth. The front porch leaned dangerously, its railing broken, a chair lying on its side as if abandoned mid-motion. The entire place seemed on the verge of collapsing under the weight of years. Leah cut the engine and sat in silence, staring at her inheritance. A laugh, sharp and humorless, escaped her throat. Her cousins had been right. This was no prize. This was a burden, a ruin that could never be sold, never repaired without draining her of every resource. And yet, as she stepped out of the car and let the heat wrap around her, something inside her shifted. She walked across the overgrown yard, weeds brushing her legs, the air filled with the buzzing of insects. The farmhouse loomed above her, its shadow stretching across the grass. Up close, it smelled of dust, wood rot, and something faintly metallic, like old nails. She pressed her hand against the door frame and the rough wood crumbled under her touch. Pushing the door open took effort. It groaned on rusted hinges, and when it finally yielded, a wave of stale air rushed out, thick with mildew. Leah stepped inside. The interior was dim, only narrow shafts of light slipping through cracks in the boards. Dust coated everything in sight. Sheets draped over old furniture, sagging with age, while cobwebs hung from the ceiling in delicate veils. The floor creaked beneath her weight, each step echoing as though the house had been waiting for her return. She pulled the sheet from the nearest piece of furniture and uncovered a wooden table scarred with burn marks. Another sheet revealed a chair with one leg broken. Along the far wall stood a bookshelf, its contents swollen and warped from dampness. Leah trailed her fingers across the spines of books, disintegrating flakes of paper falling onto her hand. In one corner, she noticed a small chest. Its brass latch was tarnished, the wood warped, but when she opened it, she found a stack of photographs. She lifted them carefully, wiping away the dust. The first showed her grandmother as a young woman, standing beside people Leah didn't recognize, men and women smiling, arms draped around each other. They were black, like her, but strangers. She turned to another photograph, her grandmother again, but younger still, her eyes fierce, her hand clutching a folded sign with words too faded to read. The discovery made Leah pause. She'd never known her grandmother to smile, never known her as someone who belonged to a group, someone who carried conviction in her face. These images didn't match the stern matriarch she remembered. They suggested a past hidden carefully, a life she had never been told about. She set the photographs aside and continued exploring. In the kitchen, rust coated the sink and a faded curtain clung to a rod above the window. A pan sat on the stove, long since blackened. It was as though someone had left abruptly and never returned. As evening settled outside, the house grew darker. Leah stood in the center of the living room, hugging herself against the chill that seeped through the floorboards. The farmhouse was a wreck, but beneath the decay there was something more. It felt alive, not with warmth, but with secrets pressing against the walls, eager to be found. She stayed longer than she intended, drawn deeper into the silence. At one point, she thought she heard a faint noise upstairs, like the scuff of a shoe against wood. She froze, heart pounding, but when she listened harder, there was nothing. Only the groan of old beams settling into the night. Still, She could not shake the feeling of being watched. Reluctantly, she stepped outside. The forest had grown darker, the sky streaked with orange fading into purple. The air was still, heavy, carrying the scent of damp earth. She looked back at the farmhouse. From this angle, its silhouette against the trees seemed less like a ruin and more like a sentinel, standing guard over something it refused to surrender. Her grandmother had chosen her. For what reason, she could not yet understand. But as Leah locked the car and prepared to leave, she knew with startling certainty that she could not walk away from this place. It held too many unanswered questions, too many threads leading into the past she had been denied. When she drove back toward town, headlights cutting through the forest shadows, she felt the weight of the farmhouse settle in her chest. She had come expecting nothing but disappointment, and she had found more than she could name. The house was falling apart, yet it pulled her closer. It was no gift, not in the conventional sense, but a challenge, a puzzle wrapped in decay. As she reached the edge of the main road, Leah caught a glimpse in her rearview mirror. For just a moment, she thought she saw another pair of headlights flicker far behind her, weaving between the trees. The image disappeared almost instantly, swallowed by darkness, but the unease lingered, and her grip on the steering wheel tightened. The farmhouse was hers now, but something told her she was not the only one who cared about what secrets it held. The drive back from the farmhouse weighed on Leah like a stone pressing down on her chest. The headlights of her rental car pierced the tunnel of trees, but her mind remained inside the ruin she had just left behind. The photographs especially would not let her go. They were ordinary prints, faded and curled with time, but in their shadows lay questions she had never thought to ask. Why had her grandmother stood with strangers, smiling in a way Leah had never once seen in person? Why had she hidden that part of herself? The woman Leah remembered had been sharp-tongued and reserved, quick to pass judgment, slow to offer comfort. Yet in those photographs was another person entirely, someone alive with conviction, her eyes bright and fearless. It was like discovering a stranger inside the body of someone she thought she knew. Sleep did not come easily that night. At the motel, she lay staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint buzz of the air conditioner and the hum of passing traffic on the highway. Her thoughts kept circling back to the house. She had only scratched the surface. Every creak of the floorboards, every shadow clinging to the corners seemed a whisper of something more. Secrets lingered there, buried under dust and wood rot, waiting for her. By morning, Leah's hesitation had given way to determination. She drove back to the farmhouse as the sun climbed higher. The dirt road dappled with light streaming through the canopy above. This time, she did not linger outside. The house no longer felt like a ruin she should avoid, but a vault holding answers. She needed to open it. Inside, the air was cool and damp, carrying the heavy scent of mildew. Dust motes swirled in the beams of light breaking through cracks in the boards. Leah retraced her steps from the day before, moving from room to room, but her eyes sought something new, something she had missed. The photographs had been only the beginning. She wanted to know what lay deeper. She started in the kitchen. Pulling open cabinets, she found stacks of cracked dishes, pans rusted through with holes, boxes of food so old the labels had faded into yellow smears. In one drawer, a cluster of old letters tied with string lay crumbling under her touch. The ink bled into unreadable stains. They were disappointments, nothing more than fragments too damaged to offer answers. The living room held little beyond sagging furniture and books swollen from damp. Yet something about the bookshelf drew her attention again. The books seemed shoved together too tightly, almost as if hiding something. She tugged one free, coughing as dust exploded into the air. Behind the row of warped spines, the faint outline of a panel became visible. She leaned closer, running her fingers along the edges. It shifted ever so slightly beneath her touch. Heart pounding, she pressed harder, and the panel gave way with a groan, revealing a hollow space behind. Inside, there was no treasure, no letters, no keepsakes, only darkness. But when she reached in, her hand brushed against something rough. She pulled it forward, and to her shock, the entire section of the wall seemed to move. A gust of colder air rushed out, carrying the damp, earthy smell of a place long sealed away. The bookshelf, heavy and stubborn, scraped forward inch by inch until an opening yawned behind it. Beyond was a narrow door, its wood swollen but intact. Leah's pulse quickened. She had stumbled upon a hidden passage. The door resisted at first, its hinges rusted with age. She shoved against it, her shoulder straining until it finally cracked open with a sharp snap. A stairwell descended into darkness, the wooden steps narrow and steep, coated in dust. The air rising from below was colder still, tinged with the scent of earth, stone, and something metallic, like iron. It felt untouched, preserved in silence. Leah hesitated, gripping the frame. Every instinct told her to leave, to wait until she had more light, until she was not alone. But another part of her, the same part that had driven her to leave her family, to carve out her own path, refused to back down. She pulled out the flashlight she had brought, clicked it on, and stepped carefully onto the first stair. The wood groaned under her weight, but held. Each step echoed into the void, swallowed quickly by the damp air. Cobwebs brushed against her arms, dust falling in soft clouds with every movement. She descended slowly, the flashlight beam quivering as her hand shook. The stairwell seemed to go on longer than it should have, spiraling her deeper into the earth. Finally, her feet touched concrete, and the beam of her light revealed a cellar. The space was larger than she expected, carved partly from stone, partly supported by timber beams now darkened with age. Cobwebs veiled the corners, and the floor was scattered with debris, broken bottles, scraps of cloth, rusted tools. Against the far wall stood old furniture stacked haphazardly, a wardrobe leaning sideways, a dresser with drawers gaping open like a mouth. Leah's flashlight swept across the room until it landed on a chest in the center, squat and heavy, its surface scarred and rusted. She approached slowly, the sound of her breath loud in her ears. Kneeling, she pressed her fingers to the lid. It resisted at first, stuck by years of neglect, then creaked open with a moan. Inside lay fragments of the past, old fabrics folded into brittle layers, their colors dulled but still clinging faintly to life. Trinkets, pins, buttons, scraps of jewelry that looked handmade. A stack of books rested at the bottom, their pages yellowed and fragile. She lifted one carefully, brushing away the dust. The handwriting inside was familiar. Her grandmother's. Leah's heart thudded as she realized she was holding her grandmother's diary. She flipped through the pages slowly, each one filled with neat, deliberate script. The entries spoke of ordinary days at first, the rhythms of farm life, the weather, the harvest. But as she turned further, the tone shifted. There were mentions of meetings held in secret, of people arriving late at night seeking shelter, of whispers that could never be spoken aloud in town. Names appeared, people Leah didn't know, but described with warmth as friends and allies. Her grandmother had been part of something hidden from the rest of the family. The diary's words were layered with urgency and fear. "The world is watching," one line read, "but here, in the shadows, we can still do our part." Another spoke of the danger of betrayal, of someone close who had threatened to expose her. Leah read faster, her fingers trembling. These were not the words of the cold, distant woman she remembered. This was someone brave, someone who had carried risks in silence, someone who had chosen to fight quietly when the world outside turned cruel. Among the pages was a folded packet of letters tied with twine. She opened them carefully and found messages written in another hand, tender words of love and longing. They spoke of a bond hidden away, of nights stolen in secrecy. The letters were signed with a name Leah did not recognize, but the intimacy was undeniable. Her grandmother had carried a secret love, concealed even from her closest kin. At the bottom of the chest, beneath the diary and letters, was a bundle of photographs. Leah held them up to the light. Some showed groups of men and women gathered in the church basements, others in marches, faces determined and hopeful. Her grandmother appeared in many of them, her expression proud, her presence commanding. Leah's throat tightened. The woman in these images was not the one she had grown up with. She was larger than life, a figure of courage, not the distant matriarch of her memories. Closing the chest, Leah sat back on her heels, her mind spinning. The cellar felt heavier now, the air thick with the gravity of what she had uncovered. She could almost sense her grandmother's presence lingering, as if the woman had waited for this moment, for Leah to discover the truth. She lingered in the cellar for a long time, flashlight beam darting over the stone walls, the piles of forgotten belongings. Every shadow seemed alive, every creak of the old beams above reminding her of the years that had passed in silence. Eventually, with her arms full of the diary and letters, she climbed the stairs again, each step echoing with new purpose. When she emerged into the dim light of the living room, the farmhouse no longer seemed like a ruin to her. It was a puzzle, a map drawn in ink and memory, guiding her deeper into the life her grandmother had hidden. And though fear coiled in her stomach, there was also something else. Connection. As if through these fragments she was finally meeting the woman she had lost long before death took her. Standing in the dusty air of the house, Leah realized that what she had inherited was more than a crumbling property. It was a key, one that opened doors into a history buried deliberately, a history that perhaps others did not want her to know. As the last of the daylight faded beyond the broken windows, Leah felt the farmhouse settle around her, its silence no longer empty but charged with secrets. She clutched the diary to her chest and whispered into the stillness, though she wasn't sure if she was speaking to her grandmother or to herself. "I'm not leaving." The words echoed back, swallowed by the walls. When Leah returned to the motel that night, her arms still aching from carrying the diary and letters, she felt as though the world she knew had been tilted on its axis. The pages she had read in the cellar whispered through her thoughts like ghosts. Her grandmother had not been the silent, cold woman she remembered from childhood visits, but someone far more complex, someone who had taken risks, who had offered shelter, who had lived a secret life carved out of courage and fear. It was impossible to reconcile the image she carried of her grandmother, sitting stiffly in the corner of family gatherings, pursed lips pressed into a thin line, with the young woman in the photographs who marched with others, head high, or the words scrawled in the diary about fighting quietly against injustice. Sleep again proved impossible. Each time she closed her eyes, lines from the diary flared against the dark. The mention of betrayal haunted her most of all, the warning that someone close had threatened to reveal what she had been doing. Leah wondered if that betrayal had come from within the family, if perhaps the bitterness that seemed to hang over them like a storm cloud was rooted in secrets long buried. And if that was true, then the fact that her grandmother had chosen her, Leah, the one who had been pushed to the margins, seemed deliberate, almost fated. By morning, she could no longer resist the pull. She drove back to the farmhouse with the diary on the passenger seat, her fingers brushing over its worn cover at every stoplight, as though it might vanish if she didn't keep touching it. The road into the woods felt less hostile now, though still oppressive, the branches clawing at her car as she pushed forward. When the farmhouse came into view, leaning in its crooked silence, she no longer saw only decay. She saw it as a living archive, a vessel holding truths too dangerous or too painful to share in life. Inside, the air was cooler than outside, the shadows long and patient. She settled herself at the old wooden table in the living room, pulling a chair into place despite its uneven leg. With the diary spread before her and the letters stacked neatly to one side, she began to read in earnest. The early pages had already offered glimpses of the ordinary, weather reports, notes about harvests, the rhythm of days that had seemed simple on the surface. But soon the tone shifted. The handwriting itself seemed to tighten. The lines pressed harder into the page as though her grandmother had written with urgency, with purpose. Leah read about visitors arriving under cover of night, strangers who knocked softly on the back door and were hurried inside. The descriptions were vague, likely intentional in case the pages were ever discovered, but the hints were clear enough. These were people fleeing something, seeking safety. Her grandmother had given it to them. Leah's heart quickened as she turned to entries that spoke of meetings, gatherings held in church basements or behind shuttered windows, where words were exchanged in whispers and plans formed in silence. There were names that recurred, initials that seemed coded, and repeated mentions of secrecy being paramount. Then came the darker passages, warnings of danger. "They watch us," one line read. "They know more than they should. If they come here, everything will be lost." As she turned another page, her breath caught at a sudden shift in tone. Her grandmother had written of someone close to her, someone who had threatened to expose her work. The betrayal seemed to cut deep, though she never named the person outright. The entry ended abruptly, as though she had been interrupted, but the bitterness in the words lingered like a wound that had never healed. Leah leaned back, the diary trembling in her hands. Who had betrayed her grandmother? The question settled like a stone in her stomach. The family she had left behind, so tight-knit in their silence, suddenly seemed more complicated than ever. Could the same bitterness that had driven them to reject her be the same poison that had eaten at her grandmother's life? The thought was unbearable, but the diary left little doubt that someone had turned against her. Setting the book aside, Leah opened the packet of letters. The handwriting here was softer, more fluid, the tone tender in ways her grandmother's never was. The words spoke of love, of longing, of nights stolen when the world allowed it. The letters were filled with dreams of a life together, one free from fear. They were addressed to her grandmother, but signed by a name Leah did not know. Each page breathed with intimacy, painting a picture of a woman in love, a woman alive in a way Leah had never imagined her grandmother could be. She studied the photographs again, laying them across the table. In some, her grandmother stood in the midst of crowds, her eyes fierce and unyielding. In others, she leaned against unfamiliar figures, her smile genuine, her shoulders relaxed. Leah traced the edges of one photograph with her finger, as though she could feel the warmth of the moment captured there. A question formed in her mind, sharper with every passing hour. Why had her grandmother hidden all of this? Why had she allowed her family to remember her only as a severe matriarch, when she had lived a life filled with risk, conviction, and love? Perhaps the silence had been her shield. Perhaps she had buried these truths to protect not only herself, but those she had cared for. Or perhaps the betrayal she had suffered had forced her into secrecy, a wound so deep it had shaped the rest of her life. The farmhouse seemed to hum around Leah as she read. Every creak of the walls, every groan of the floorboards felt like the house breathing, urging her deeper. She could almost hear her grandmother's voice in the rustle of leaves against the windows and the faint drip of water somewhere in the pipes. The diary was no longer just a collection of words. It was a map, each entry pointing toward something more. Toward the back of the book, the entries grew more cryptic. They spoke of things hidden, of treasures kept safe in places where the light never reaches. There were references to nooks and caches, described in riddles that seemed almost like instructions. Leah's pulse raced as she realized what she was reading. Her grandmother had left behind more than memories. She had left behind a trail. The final entries were almost illegible, the ink smudged, the writing hurried. They spoke of time running out, of closing the circle, of leaving behind something for the future. The words seemed written for someone specific, though the diary never named who. Leah wondered, her breath catching, if that someone had always been meant to be her. She closed the book and pressed her hands against the worn cover, staring at the farmhouse walls. The place no longer felt like a burden left to spite her. It was a puzzle, a legacy her grandmother had entrusted to her alone. The secrets it held were not just curiosities of the past, but pieces of a story her family had tried to bury. Outside, the wind stirred, rattling the loose boards over the windows. The sound startled Leah, pulling her out of her thoughts. She stood and moved to the window, peering through a crack in the wood. The forest stretched endlessly beyond, dark and watchful. For a fleeting moment, she thought she saw something move between the trees, a flicker of shadow too deliberate to be the wind. Her breath caught, but when she looked again, the space was empty. She stepped back, her skin prickling. The unease from the night before returned, stronger now. It wasn't just the house that carried secrets. Something, or someone, was watching, but the diary in her hands gave her strength. Whatever her grandmother had meant for her to find, Leah knew she could not stop now. The riddles, the hints of hidden treasures, the shadow of betrayal, all of it demanded answers. The farmhouse was no ruin. It was a map, and she was the only one left to follow it. Leah sat in the farmhouse long after the sun had gone down, the diary resting open on the table beside her. She had read the same passage 3 times without taking in a single word, her mind distracted by the faint sound she thought she had heard outside. The boards, nailed across the windows, blocked her view, but she kept turning her head towards them as if expecting a face to appear in the cracks. The silence inside the house was too complete, and it pressed against her ears until she found herself holding her breath, straining for the smallest sound. Nothing came, only the faint sigh of wind curling through the trees. At last she closed the book and forced herself to step outside. The night air was thick and warm, full of the humming of insects and the distant croak of frogs. The forest seemed endless around her, the farmhouse nothing more than a shadow swallowed in the dark. She told herself she had imagined it, that her unease came from exhaustion and too many hours spent reading words that pulled her into a life she had never known. Yet, when she returned to the car parked at the edge of the clearing, she noticed something strange. A set of faint impressions pressed into the soft earth near the front tire. She crouched to look closer. They were footprints. She rose quickly, scanning the tree line, her heartbeat climbing into her throat. The prints were shallow, recent, perhaps made in the last few hours when she had been inside. They led from the edge of the clearing to the car and back again, vanishing into the shadows where the forest began. Leah shivered despite the heat, gripping the diary tighter as if it could shield her. Back inside, she locked the door even though the rusty latch would hardly hold against any real attempt to break in. She sat on the edge of the old couch, unable to return to the words in the diary, listening instead to the shifting sounds of the night. Every creak of the house seemed sharper now, every groan of the beams like a whisper too close. When sleep finally came, it was shallow and broken, haunted by dreams of faceless figures moving through the trees. The next morning, Leah returned to the town for supplies. The thought of staying another night without some kind of protection was unbearable. At the hardware store, she bought a heavy flashlight, new batteries, a padlock, and a few tools. The clerk, a man with sun-weathered skin and a stare that lingered too long, asked why she needed so much. She gave no answer beyond a vague smile. Already, she sensed the gossip machine stirring. This town had a way of spreading stories faster than fire in dry grass, and her return had no doubt been noted. As she loaded the items into her trunk, she noticed a familiar figure across the street. It was one of her cousins, leaning against a pickup truck, arms crossed, watching her. When their eyes met, he gave her a smile that was more sneer than greeting. Leah froze for a moment, then climbed quickly into the car. She did not look back until she was halfway down the road, but when she did, the truck was gone. That night, back at the farmhouse, she moved from room to room with the new flashlight, testing each lock, checking the windows, forcing herself to believe she was safe. Yet she could not shake the feeling that she was being watched. In the living room, she noticed the dust on the floor had been disturbed since the day before. Faint streaks curved across the boards as though something heavy had been dragged. She followed the marks to the corner where an old dresser leaned against the wall. Yesterday it had stood flush against the wood, but now it sat at an angle, a small gap visible behind it. Leah swallowed hard, the air thick in her throat. She pushed the dresser back into place, telling herself it must have shifted naturally as the floorboards warped. But deep down, she knew better. Someone had been inside. Her nights became restless vigils, her days consumed by the diary. The cryptic passages about hidden caches haunted her, hinting at treasures both sentimental and valuable. She began to suspect that whatever her grandmother had concealed was not merely a collection of letters and photographs. There was something more tangible, something her cousins might have guessed at. The memory of the man outside the hardware store returned with a shiver. Perhaps they already knew. Leah tried to focus on the diary's riddles. Where the dust gathers thickest, the truth lies beneath, one passage read. Another spoke of a hollow space where the wall meets the earth, sealed for the eyes of the worthy. They read like instructions, fragments of a scavenger hunt left behind by a woman who had lived her life in shadows. Leah traced the words with her finger, imagining her grandmother bent over the pages late at night, determined to leave a trail even if she could not leave explanations. The house responded to her search in strange ways. Each time she moved furniture or pried at floorboards, the walls seemed to groan, the air shifting as if the house itself resisted her intrusion. Yet she pressed on, convinced that somewhere within these rotting walls lay the answer to why she had been chosen. One evening, as she bent near the fireplace to inspect the stones, she felt the unmistakable sensation of being watched. The hair on her arms rose. Slowly, she turned toward the window. Through a narrow crack in the boarded wood, she caught a flicker of movement, a shadow darting between trees, too quick and deliberate to be the wind. She lunged forward, ripping at the boards until she could widen the gap, but by then the clearing was empty. Only the forest stood in silence, the fading light of dusk painting the trunks in long shadows. Her hands shook as she pulled the boards back into place. Someone had been out there, watching her just as they had before. The footprints, the shifted furniture, the sneer of her cousin in town, they all connected into a chilling realization. She was not alone in this search. Later that night, as she lay on the couch staring at the ceiling, the floor above her creaked. It was slow and deliberate, the kind of sound footsteps make when someone is trying to move quietly. Leah sat up, her heart racing. The second creak came closer to where she lay. She grabbed the heavy flashlight and held it in front of her like a weapon. "Who's there?" she whispered into the silence, though she knew she would receive no answer. The house returned to stillness, but she did not sleep again until the first light of dawn spilled through the cracks. The next morning, she stood outside the farmhouse, her eyes fixed on the woods. She could not prove who was stalking her, but she could guess. The diary, the letters, the photographs, these were not things her cousins would care about. But the mention of hidden treasures, of valuables secreted away, might be enough to draw them. The look on her cousin's face outside the hardware store replayed in her mind. It had not been curiosity in his eyes. It had been hunger. The farmhouse had become more than a crumbling inheritance. It was a battleground, and she was standing in the middle without knowing how to defend herself. The diary gave her clues, yes, but it also painted a target on her back. Her grandmother had trusted her to uncover these secrets, but perhaps she had also known the danger it would bring. Leah closed the diary with trembling hands. The farmhouse loomed behind her, its windows like blind eyes. The forest pressed close, the silence too complete. She could feel the presence of others even if she could not see them. Something told her that the ominous signs she had been noticing were only the beginning. The morning after the creaking steps above her head, Leah awoke on the sagging couch with her body stiff and her mind aching from restless half-dreams. The sunlight seeped through the cracks of the boarded windows, pale and dusty, casting long beams across the room. She blinked against it, disoriented. Her first thought the sound she had heard in the night. She sat up quickly, clutching the flashlight still in her hands. Nothing stirred above her now, but the memory of those slow, deliberate creaks left her unsettled. She knew she hadn't imagined them. Someone had been in the house. She tried to calm herself with the routine of small tasks. She brewed bitter instant coffee on a camping stove she had bought in town, the acrid smell filling the kitchen. As she sipped from a chipped mug she had washed in the rusted sink, her eyes kept drifting to the diary lying open on the table. The riddles scratched into its last pages seemed more urgent now. They spoke of hidden spaces, of a treasure tucked away where no light could find it. Each line had gnawed at her thoughts all night, and though her body begged for rest, she knew she could not leave the mystery unsolved. If someone else was already searching, every hour she delayed was a chance for them to get ahead of her. She began systematically combing through the farmhouse. She moved furniture aside, checked behind loose panels, knocked on walls for hollow echoes. Dust coated her skin, cobwebs tangled in her hair, but she pressed on. Hours slipped by in a haze of dust motes and sweat until, in the cellar once more, her flashlight beam landed on something she had not noticed before. In the far wall, half hidden behind a stack of rotten crates, one brick seemed slightly darker than the others. She stepped closer, heart quickening, and brushed her fingers across it. Unlike its neighbors, it wobbled under her touch. Carefully, she pried at it with the crowbar she had brought down from the car. The brick scraped free, releasing a small puff of stale air. Behind it was a hollow space just wide enough for her hand. She reached in, her fingers trembling, and touched something cold and metallic. She pulled it out slowly. It was a small ornate box, heavier than it looked, its surface etched with delicate patterns dulled by time. She carried it into the center of the cellar, her flashlight beam flickering across its tarnished details. The lock was simple, rusted and fragile. With a sharp twist of the crowbar, it gave way. The lid creaked open, and inside lay a collection of items wrapped in faded cloth. The first thing she unwrapped was a string of pearls, yellowed but still lustrous. Beneath it lay a brooch shaped like a bird in flight, its wings encrusted with tiny stones that sparkled faintly in the light. There were letters, folded neatly and tied with a strip of ribbon, and beneath them a handful of documents sealed in envelopes bearing dates decades old. Leah's breath caught as she lifted each piece, her hands trembling. These were not just keepsakes. These were heirlooms, possibly valuable, but more importantly, evidence of a life and a history her family had erased. At the bottom of the box was a small photograph. It showed her grandmother, younger, standing arm in arm with a man Leah did not recognize. His smile was soft, his hand resting protectively on her shoulder. There was an intimacy in the pose that made Leah's chest tighten. She thought of the letters upstairs, the tender words signed with a name unfamiliar to her. This must have been him, the secret love her grandmother had hidden away. Leah sat in the cellar for what felt like hours, staring at the contents of the box. She knew instinctively that these were what her grandmother's riddles had pointed toward, the treasures meant for her alone. But her victory was short-lived. As she climbed the stairs with the box cradled in her arms, she heard a noise above. The faint crunch of feet on broken glass, the groan of a door pushed too far open. She froze. Someone was in the house. Her first thought was to hide. She backed quickly into the corner of the cellar, tucking the box behind her, and switched off her flashlight. The darkness closed in, thick and suffocating, but she forced herself to breathe quietly. The sounds grew louder, the creak of floorboards above, a whisper, then a muffled laugh. The voices were familiar in a way that made her stomach twist. Her cousins. She clutched the box tighter, her heart pounding so hard she feared they would hear it. The cousins had mocked her at the reading of the will, sneered at her in town, followed her with eyes filled not with curiosity, but with hunger. Now she knew what they wanted. They weren't here to visit or check on her. They were hunting the same secrets she had just unearthed. The footsteps moved slowly across the house, deliberate, as though they were searching each room. Something scraped above. A piece of furniture dragged across the floor. Leah pressed herself deeper into the corner, praying the shadows would conceal her. Her grandmother's diary felt heavy in her pocket, its words a reminder that betrayal had always been close. How much had these cousins known all along? Had her grandmother sensed this greed and chosen Leah precisely because she had been an outcast, because she alone could be trusted not to sell the past for profit? The steps descended toward the cellar. Each groan of the stairwell made Leah's breath catch. She crouched lower, shielding the box with her body. A beam of light sliced into the cellar, bouncing across the stone walls. One of them had a flashlight. The beam passed dangerously close to where she hid, paused for a long moment as though sensing her, then swung away. "I told you she'd come back here," one voice muttered. "She's hiding something. Old woman wouldn't have left her this place for nothing," the other replied. Their words filled Leah with ice. They knew, or at least suspected, exactly what she had found. She stayed motionless as their search dragged on. The minutes stretched into hours, each second heavy with fear, until at last the footsteps retreated, the cellar door slammed shut, and silence returned. Leah remained crouched in the dark long after they were gone, her legs numb, her fingers aching from clutching the box. When she finally emerged, the house was empty, but the violation lingered. Her cousins had walked these rooms, touched these walls, invaded the fragile sanctuary her grandmother had left her. Rage simmered beneath her fear. This was her inheritance, her legacy, not theirs to steal. She placed the box on the table and pulled out her phone with shaking hands. For a moment, she considered calling a friend in the city, someone she trusted to talk her down from the panic. But then, she realized this had gone beyond anything a friend could help her with. She dialed the police instead. Her voice trembled as she explained that intruders had broken into the house, that she feared they would return. The dispatcher assured her officers would come. She hung up and sat with her arms wrapped around herself, waiting, every creak of the house making her flinch. When the flashing lights finally broke through the trees, relief flooded her so sharply she almost cried. She stepped outside to meet them, the ornate box clutched to her chest. The officers swept through the farmhouse, checking each room, shining their flashlights into every corner. It didn't take long before they found what Leah had feared. Her cousins were still nearby, caught lurking in the woods behind the house. They tried to bluff, claiming they had only come to check on her, that they had been worried about her safety. But when the police led them out in handcuffs, their faces twisted with fury, Leah saw the truth plain in their eyes. The betrayal cut deeper than she had imagined. These were the people she had once eaten dinner beside, the children she had played with in dusty yards, the family that had mocked her for leaving but still shared her blood. Now they had broken into her house, tried to steal from her, driven by greed and entitlement. Their voices rang in her ears, filled with excuses and denials even as the police loaded them into the patrol car. The farmhouse stood silent again after the officers left, but it no longer felt like the same place. The shadows were heavier now, the silence sharper. Leah stood in the doorway, the box still in her hands, her chest tight with sorrow. Her grandmother's legacy had not only revealed hidden courage and love, but also stripped bare the rot that lay within the family. She locked the door behind her, knowing it would do little good. Yet, as she sat once more at the old table, the diary and the box before her, she understood that the fight was no longer about money or heirlooms. It was about trust broken, history erased, and the choice of whether she would protect the truth or let it be swallowed by greed. The betrayal had come not from strangers, but from her own kin. And in that moment, she finally understood the full weight of what her grandmother had written. Secrecy, betrayal, the fear of being exposed by those closest to her. The past had repeated itself, and Leah was the one now standing in its shadow. The flashing lights of the patrol cars had long since faded from the clearing, swallowed by the forest and the night. But Leah still sat at the farmhouse table, her hands wrapped tightly around the ornate box, as if letting go of it would undo everything. The silence pressed heavily on her ears, punctuated only by the occasional groan of the old beams overhead and the faint rustle of leaves outside. The betrayal of her cousins clung to her like a second skin, raw and stinging. She could still hear their voices, raised in protest as the officers led them away, insisting they had every right to be there, that what she had found belonged to them as much as it did to her. Family, they had said, as if blood alone could excuse greed and trespass. But Leah knew better now. Blood was not enough. Blood had never been enough. Her family had exiled her years ago, made her the scapegoat for every choice they disapproved of, and now, when something of worth had surfaced, they had reappeared not with open arms but with grasping hands. She thought again of her grandmother's words, scratched into the brittle pages of the diary, of betrayal, of secrecy, of those closest who could not be trusted. Her grandmother had lived through the same bitterness, and it had shaped the woman she became. Now it was shaping Leah as well. She pushed the box aside gently and opened the diary once more. Her fingers traced the ink of the final entries, the hurried, smudged lines that spoke of time running out and leaving something behind for the future. For Leah. The realization hit her with sudden clarity. Her grandmother had chosen her not because of affection, not out of obligation, but because she knew Leah would understand. She had lived on the margins, had been cast out, and so she would recognize the importance of protecting what the others would only exploit. The diary, the photographs, the love letters, the jewelry, these were not prizes to be fought over. They were fragments of a legacy, a testament to courage and endurance, and it was her responsibility to guard them. She rose and walked slowly through the house, her flashlight beam sweeping across the walls and furniture. The farmhouse no longer looked like a ruin. Though the boards were broken, the windows clouded with dust, the roof sagging dangerously, she no longer saw only decay. She saw history embedded in every crack of the wood, every nail driven into the beams, every secret tucked into the shadows. This place had sheltered her grandmother's hidden life, had borne witness to meetings, to whispered plans, to love written in secret letters. It was not an accident that it had survived untouched for so long. It was waiting, preserved for the one who would care enough to see it for what it was. Outside, the dawn was breaking. The sky over the forest blushed pale pink, then deepened into orange. Birds began to stir, their calls threading through the trees, tentative at first and then swelling into a chorus. Leah stepped onto the porch, her arms crossed over her chest, and watched the world shift from shadow to light. The air was damp and cool, carrying the scent of soil and pine, and for the first time since she had set foot in this place, she felt a measure of peace. The farmhouse would not be easy to keep. The structure was failing, the land overrun, the taxes a burden she would have to shoulder. But even as she thought of the obstacles, she felt a stubborn determination rising in her chest. She could restore it. Not to its former state, perhaps, that might be impossible, but into something new, something that honored its past while offering a future. A place of memory, a place of truth. She imagined cleaning the rooms, pulling down the warped boards, letting light flood through the windows again. She imagined preserving the diary and the letters, displaying the photographs in frames where they could be seen instead of hidden away. She imagined planting flowers in the overgrown yard, painting the porch, rebuilding the sagging beams. Not to make the farmhouse a comfortable home, but to transform it into a monument of sorts, a tribute to the woman her grandmother had been, and to the struggle she had carried in silence. A place where forgotten voices could still be heard. The thought steadied her. For too long she had drifted in the city, her life quiet and small, invisible even to herself. She had buried her own history, run from the pain of her family, convinced herself she needed nothing but solitude. But here, standing on the porch of a broken house in the woods, she realized she had been wrong. She needed purpose. She needed connection. She needed to claim her story as much as her grandmother had claimed hers. The betrayal of her cousins still hurt, sharp and bitter, but it no longer defined her. Their greed had exposed what she already knew, that they cared only for what could be sold or flaunted. But Leah had been given something far greater than trinkets. She had been given truth, and with it the responsibility to protect it. She thought of the look in her grandmother's eyes in those old photographs, steady and unwavering, and felt the echo of that strength pulse through her. The farmhouse creaked in the morning wind, its boards shifting as though exhaling after a long night. Leah turned back toward it, and for the first time she did not see its brokenness as a curse. She saw it as resilience. Against years of neglect, against secrecy and silence, it still stood, and so would she. She stepped back inside and placed the diary, the letters, and the box carefully in the center of the table. Sunlight filtered through the gaps in the boards, laying stripes of gold across the wood. The farmhouse was no longer an inheritance she had been tricked into taking. It was hers now, in every sense, not just by law, but by blood, by choice, by conviction. Her grandmother had left her a burden, yes, but also a gift. And though the path forward would not be easy, Leah knew she had already taken the first step. She would stay, she would rebuild, she would remember. As she sat once more in the quiet, her hands resting on the diary, she whispered a promise to the house, to the woman who had come before her, and to herself. I will not let this be forgotten. The words settled into the air, carried softly into the silence, and for the first time, Leah felt that she was no longer alone. If you loved this story, don't stop here. Hit that subscribe button right now so you never miss the next shocking twist. And when you're done, jump into our other incredible videos waiting for you on the channel. Trust me, you won't believe what happens in those. Share this video with your friends and family. Let them uncover the mystery too.